When you give talks like this, you can always find the one or two people who disagree with you. And it's really great because this is well lit, so if you disagree with me, I'll be able to figure out pretty quick. A couple of years ago, I was giving a talk on humility at a men's group at a parish. And it was a smaller group than this, in a smaller room than this. And as I got about halfway through the talk, there was one gentleman who you could tell was disagreeing with me. And if you've ever given a presentation at a business, at a school, at a church, you know that the tendency is to start to talk to that person and not everybody else. So I get fixated on this one guy because I want to make him love me. And he doesn't. His arms are folded. His face is scowled. And when I say certain things, he goes, He nudges the guy next to him. Oh. We get done with the talk, and there's a question and answer period. So whose hand goes up first? The guy who doesn't like me. And he says, I got a question for you. The gentleman's in his mid-50s, maybe his early 60s. So he's several years my senior, and I respect the experience and the wisdom he brings. He says, I disagree with you. And in my head, I'm thinking, I know. I had been talking about how humility is the foundation of leadership, how humility is the foundation of discipleship, how humility is the foundation of good relationships. And he said, that's all well and good. But in our world, because I'd spoken about leadership and how humility applies in business, he said, in our world, in the business world, we do what we need to do at work. And some of the things you suggested, like mentorship, empowering other people, not taking all of the credit, that doesn't work in my world. That doesn't work in our world. So we do what we do for 40 or 50 hours a week, but when we get home, that's really where we live discipleship. And I said, sir, if who you are for 40 or 50 hours a week is not a disciple, then that's not who you are. I take that back. That's what I said in my head. What I said to him out loud was, that's an interesting point. You see, I get worried about what people think about me sometimes. And he put me back on my heels. There was that one guy in the audience, and I could not shake him from my mind. Humility is something we wrestle with, isn't it? I mean, how much of that guy's response could you see in yourself? At least I can see it in me. When we talk about something like humility, I think about something that makes me less. I don't know what your formation is when it comes to humility, but for a long time I thought humility was self-deprecating. If somebody compliments you and you have to throw it back at them. Hey, I really liked that talk you gave. Hey, thank you for helping me out with the move. Thank you for being present to me. Somebody gives us a compliment. I think you're really good at whatever. And sometimes we throw it back at them. I do. Oh, it has nothing to do with me. I'm a poor, depraved sinner. Please, your compliments feel like needles against my humble skin. No, it's all about the Lord, not about me. And that's a great recipe for people to never compliment you ever again. I'm like, that feels icky, talking to that guy. I want people to like me. And so when I stand up in front of groups of people like this, I'm nervous. I want to go through my bio and establish credibility. I want to tell you about my education. I want to tell you about my background. I want to tell you about how I coach 6-year-olds in a flag football league, and it's the most maddening and awesome thing ever. The touchdown's that way, Noah. That way. But then a part of me is like, am I being prideful? How do I distinguish what is establishing credibility with a group of people who have a lot of great life experience and a lot of wisdom, and me, somebody who's got 2 kids, one who's almost 7, one who turned 5 yesterday, and is still trying to figure a lot of the things out that all of you have figured out? Is it pride to come forward and be like, here's my resume? Or is that doing something smart by making you want to listen to me a little bit more? Because again, if I'm being honest, it's nerve-wracking to be up in front of a group of people and presenting on something as fun as humility is. I learned about the virtue of humility when I was a youth minister. I started youth ministry at 21 years old. I worked at a parish. It was the largest parish in the Diocese of Green Bay. It had just consolidated 6 churches down into one. So if you can imagine that, 6 different parish communities a year or 2 prior to me being hired there, all turned into one big happy family. And here I come, 21 years old. I remember sitting in a staff meeting, and our business manager said, we really want to reach the youth of this parish in this town where 50% of the population of this particular town was Catholic. That's really amazing. There's a great Catholic culture there, a great Catholic undercurrent. It was a wonderful place to do ministry, but a lot of the youth were disengaged. The transition between the 6 parishes hadn't worked well. And me at 21 years old, I looked at all of these staff members, people with a lot of life experience, a lot of ministry experience, and I said, don't worry. By January, we'll have 150 teens coming to our youth group. I am the youth ministry Messiah. I've come to save your teenagers. By January, we had 7 teens. Not 17, 7 teens total. Half of my volunteers had quit. One of them cursed me out when he quit in front of a couple teens, which is probably why they stopped coming as well. I was devastated. I remember praying to God before one of our youth nights just to get me out of that parish. But I wasn't like, Lord, I've failed. Lord, I'm not worthy. I was like, God, my talents are being wasted here. You need to take me to a parish where I'll be appreciated. I sat down at that night with this group of 7 teens. And the night was about prayer. And I said, hey, has anybody ever prayed for something and not gotten it? And of course, everybody's hands go up. Of course, everybody's prayed for something and felt like they didn't get it. And in my heart, I was like, me too. This whole job, my unanswered prayer, pretty salty. And then I said, has anybody ever prayed for something and actually received that which they prayed for? And one girl named Jolene raised her hand. And she said, yeah, last year about this time, our youth minister left. And we had such a great community here, we were worried that it would fall apart. And we prayed for a new youth minister. And then God sent you. I don't know how the Lord interacts with you or what your relationship with God is like. Mine involves a lot of real heavy hits and sort of like backhand slaps. And that was one of them. Here I was, moments before, saying, God, I shouldn't be here. You should take me away from me. My talent is being wasted. And I forgot that it wasn't about me. It was about what God wanted to do through me. Moments before I was ready to quit, and this one sophomore girl put things into perspective. Well, we prayed for you. You were the answer to our prayer. I knew something needed to change. And so in talking with one of my friends, he said, you should try out this thing called the Litany of Humility. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this prayer, but the Litany of Humility is a series of petitions that first ask us for deliverance from a disordered desire. So we pray from the desire of being esteemed, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being loved, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being consulted, deliver me, Jesus. We ask deliverance from disordered desires that tend towards pride. When we ask for deliverance from something, though, it leaves a hole inside of us. And so that hole can be filled by fear. Anytime there's a negative space, fear can creep in to that space. So we ask for deliverance from fears. From the fear of being despised, deliver me, Jesus. From the fear of being calumniated, which is the best word in the Litany of Humility. It means to be gossiped about in a way that destroys your reputation. Deliver me, Jesus. From the fear of being forgotten, deliver me, Jesus. And then we ask God to fill us with a rightly ordered desire. That others would be loved more than I. Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it. That others would be chosen and I set aside. Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it. That others may become holier than I, provided that I become as holy as I should. Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it. It's a beautiful prayer. You can Google it and find a version. There's one on EWTN, which is EWTN.com. That's the most popular version. And my friend handed me this prayer and said, you should pray this daily. It'll change your life. It'll help you find humility, because I realized that was something I was lacking and something I needed. And it did change my life. To pray for humility is to offer a prayer that God will always answer. So unlike all the hands that went up for an unanswered prayer, if you pray for humility, God finds a way to respond to that. But when we pray for humility, I found that there's a fear and a misunderstanding that goes along with it that I had. Years later, I would publish a book called Chasing Humility that dove into the idea of what humility is and how we live that out practically. And when I shared that with people, it's interesting. If you write a book, even if you're self-publishing, and you tell people about that, there's a very romantic idea behind writing a book. And so when you say to somebody, yeah, I'm working on a book, people go, oh, wow, that's amazing. You're writing a book? I hated English class. You're writing a whole book. Yeah, nobody would be more surprised than my English teacher, Mr. Scott. But then people ask, well, what are you writing about? And when I'd say to people, well, I'm writing the book about humility, it was wild how quickly they changed. I'm writing a book about humility. Oh, that sounds terrible. One person was like, don't you think that's dangerous? Dangerous? Yeah, isn't God going to wreck your life? Now, it is true, in the process of writing the book of humility, God gave me lots of opportunities to practice the virtue of humility. But I almost wonder if the prayer for humility is less about God than being like, oh, good, now I'm going to kind of throw a bunch of stuff on you to humble you, and is more about our eyes being open to all of the ways we have in our life right now to be a more humble person. I put this book together. People responded to it initially with kind of this I don't want to get involved in it. I even had people who read the book afterwards and be like, hey, thanks for the book. I was like, yeah, you're welcome, but you seem angry. You're like, it ruined my life. Well, I should feel kind of good about that, I guess. I don't know. What is it about humility that we wrestle with? From my time wrestling with pride and humility to the issues that some of us have with self-deprecation and understanding what humility is, to that man at that session who said, humility is all well and good in your personal life, but when it comes to the business world, when it comes to leadership, when it comes to having to get things done, humility just doesn't work. What is it about this virtue that we sometimes push back against, especially as men? I think it relates to a misperception that many of us have about what humility is. And part of it stems from the fact that humility doesn't always seem practical. I've heard many people get up on stages like this, perhaps you have too, and they've started to talk about humility, and then they say something like this. But when you start to talk about humility, you already know that you're failing at it. So here's this thing that we're supposed to practice that's a good thing. Jesus says, I'm meek and humble of heart, so we want to imitate Jesus. And yet, we aren't supposed to talk about it, because if I start to talk about humility, then maybe I'm not very humble, and how do I even practically live this out? I found that in the Litany of Humility itself, there's actually some very practical steps that we can take to growing in humility, just woven into this prayer. The Litany of Humility is attributed to a man named Raphael Cardinal Mary del Val. He worked in the Vatican for many years, and after his passing, they found this prayer on his desk, the Litany of Humility. And after that, it became very popular and shared through many channels. Many people use it as a part of their prayer life, and I'd encourage you to do the same. But if you go through those petitions of deliverance from a disordered desire, deliverance from a fear, and Jesus giving us a new desire, some themes emerge that are very practical. From the Litany of Humility, we learn that humility is actually confidence. Not the type of prideful confidence that relies on my own skill and ability, but confidence in knowing who I am before God and who I'm created as a son of God the Father. Humility is gratitude for the gifts that God has given us. Humility is loving others. Humility is giving praise to others. Humility is empowering others, mentoring others. Humility is even breaking through the boundaries we set on our life to evangelize others and share the good news. Humility is being authentic. Now, all of these things take place with our effort and grace. That's what I think is so wonderful about some of these practical aspects of humility. God gives us the grace and we act on that grace, but there's something we can do. And I'm a very practical person. So if you give me something theoretical, I like that. But I also want to know what I'm supposed to do. What are the next steps that I need to take? Our world needs humility. And again, in the secular world, there's plenty of data about what humility does. It's sort of the secret sauce. A man named Jim Collins wrote a book called From Good to Great. It's a business classic. But in it, he identifies a level 5 leader, the leaders who can take something from good to great, as having some key traits. It's called transformational leadership. And one of the key traits of transformational leadership is humility. In relationships, many of you maybe are married. You know, humility is something that gets you a lot farther than stubbornness. And in the spiritual life, humility is the foundation of discipleship. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it says humility is the foundation of prayer. To approach God, we have to first say in prayer, God, you are God, and I am not. That's why at the beginning of the Our Father, we say, Our Father, putting me in a familiar relationship, but a submissive relationship to the Father. Hallowed be your name. Holy is your name, set apart. Humility is the foundation of prayer. This thing is critical to us, but it's something so critical in our world that touches all aspects of our life. We've got to know how to do this well. Now, there are those 8 characteristics of humility that shape our heart. But I think the one we need to begin with is authenticity. To have an authentic understanding of who we are is the beginning of humility. And for us, what does that look like as being authentically masculine? There are a couple of petitions in the Litany of Humility that line up here. When we talk about becoming authentic, we're talking about being delivered from the desire of being esteemed. I told you at the beginning, I care about what people think about me. I wish I didn't. But if I'm being honest with you, I look at all of the reviews from the talks I give. I find myself on Amazon looking at the reviews or the rating of a book. And it's not because I need it to feel good about myself. It's because a part of me still struggles with my worth being wrapped up in those things. I care about what people think about me. And so this petition from the Litany of Humility relates to authenticity, from the desire of being esteemed. Lord, deliver me from the desire that people would praise me or extol me or celebrate me, or that I would put my worth in what they say. Once we let go of that desire, though, there's a fear that creeps in, the fear of being wronged, a fear that somebody would hurt us, a fear that rather than esteeming us, people would actively seek to harm us. And then when we talk about authenticity, we need to talk about holiness. And really, that's what it gets down to. To be authentic is to be a replication, a work that imitates something else. And we are authentic disciples when we are imitations of Christ. Authenticity relates to holiness. Now, I'm going to give you a little secret of psychology. And this applies at any level of life, but for you younger men in the audience, I want you to write this down because it's the key to joy and to fulfillment. There are 3 aspects to authenticity. The first is who God says that I am. And if you want to imagine these things, you can imagine 3 circles in like a triangle shape where they overlap in the middle. If you want to draw that out. The top circle is who God says that I am. This is truth. This is fixed. This is sure. It doesn't change. Nothing you do can alter it. Who God says you are is fixed. Then in the next circle, it's who I say I am. This is the story you tell yourself when you look in the mirror. Who do you think you are? Who do you say your identity is? And then the third circle is who I want others to see me as. And this is important because it's not what do others think of me. I have no control over that. But I do control how I want them to see me. Now, when these 3 things line up, who God says I am, who I say I am, and what I want others to think about me, who I show to others, when those things line up, our life is in harmony. Think back to any time that you've struggled in life, any time you felt disordered, any time you felt out of sorts. I'm willing to bet that it's because one of those three areas was in misalignment. One of those three areas did not match up. Now, I've presented this particular message to a few groups of people, and over time I've realized that there's one twist in it that throws people off. That top circle, who God says I am, not everybody has that as the top circle. And it's important because that top tier is where I reference back to. It's my reference point. And for a lot of people, the flaw in their thinking is that that top one isn't who God says I am. It's who other people say I am. Which creates this sort of real toxic cycle. I tell a story about myself and I want to present myself in a certain way to other people that makes me acceptable because I care so much about what they think. I base my value, my worth, my foundational truth on what they say about me. And what they say about me then influences the story I tell about myself, which then forces me to present myself in a certain way to other people. And it goes around and around and around. And it looks different for everybody. So for some people, that's creating a particular persona on social media. And if we think that teenagers, a group of people that I work with often, are the only ones who do that, it's not. I want you to think of how many times you've seen somebody else post something on Facebook, perhaps, that's made you jealous of their life. They're cultivating things so that you think about them in a certain way. It could be anything. What my coworkers think about me, what my boss thinks about me, what my friends think about me, what my spouse thinks about me. See, even good things can get disordered when this is out of whack, right? I know a lot of people who live their entire life trying to please their spouse because at the end of the day, their spouse's opinion of them is what matters more than God. It's not wrong that you should want to honor and serve your spouse or your family. That's very important. But even a good thing can get disordered when it becomes the greatest thing in our life. And the greatest thing, the greatest good is the Lord. I think for guys, this top tier is also, there's something else going on here. Which, as I've thought about this and I've prayed about this, I think has been the most sly and cunning demonic attack that has taken place on men in recent history. You hear a lot in the news about toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity. As this thing that we have to eradicate, and it's the call toxic masculinity, and toxic masculinity exists. We would say it does in the world of discipleship. It's the man who's greedy, the man who's vicious, the man who's lustful, the man who uses others, the man who is hateful, slothful, vengeful, envious. These things sound familiar. That's toxic masculinity. Unfortunately, many people in the secular world have used toxic masculinity as a call to erase all masculinity. That the masculine shouldn't exist at all. And this is where I think the slyest attack of the devil has taken place. Years and years ago, these elements of toxic masculinity were introduced as the gold standard for masculinity. What is a man? He's rich, he's powerful, he's feared. What is a man in the media? Somebody who's able to get around with women, somebody who earns the respect of his peers through any means necessary. And even though as Christians we could reject some of those things, we're in the stew. And if you've ever eaten a stew, all the stuff in that pot kind of takes on the flavor. No one's immune to it. But our culture propped up this idea of what a man should be, which was already distorted to begin with. And the devil props it up. Because years later, the devil knows that it will take it down. And society will push back against the monster it made and say, not only is this type of masculinity bad, which we would wholeheartedly say, yes, it is, but that all masculinity is bad. That the masculine needs to be erased completely. That is a clever but demonic plan to destroy something very important in our world. What you and I bring as a unique reflection of the masculine attributes of God. So I think in that top circle, the challenge for us is, who does God say that we are as men? What does it mean to be authentically masculine in a way that lives humility? Let's go back to Genesis, because there's a blueprint laid out in the book of Genesis at the very beginning. And the key to this, as we dive in it literally hangs the balance of our world today. And again, as a person who works with teenagers, I'll say this. I do have a bit of an agenda. Young people need you and your witness and your example of what it means to be an authentic man, and a humble man, and a disciple. I could nerd out on generational theory for hours, but I'll only say this. Young people today, teenagers, do not trust institutions. They don't. They don't trust the church. They don't necessarily trust their schools. They don't trust politicians. But they trust people so long as you prove yourself to be authentic. It's almost as though the world listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. I feel like I've heard that before. And so you need to be witnesses. Not people who simply teach the faith, but people who embody it and are authentic. Because if a teenager encounters you, if a young adult encounters you, if a peer encounters you, if an elder encounters you, because we all are drawn to this reality and sees you as an authentic example of a disciple and one who lives the masculine identity and authentic masculinity, in contradiction to the toxic masculinity that the world was sold and now the world rejects, there's something alluring about that. And you will evangelize people because they will come to see Christ in you. So here's how we reclaim it. I believe that there are 3 fixed truths to masculinity as revealed in the book of Genesis and then perfected in Christ. God creates Adam. And he puts him in a garden. And he gives Adam 2 commands in the garden. You protect it, and you cultivate it. He put a man to till the soil of the earth. And then he gives this man a command to protect the garden. Out of Genesis 1, we get another command to both the man and the woman: be fertile and multiply, be fruitful and multiply. Create. So there are these 3 aspects to what I think authentic masculinity looks like for any person at any age. 1, we are called to be protectors. We are called to cultivate virtue in our lives, and we are called to create. You know, look at Jesus. Jesus exemplifies each of these pieces perfectly. Adam, the old man, failed as a protector. The serpent, Leviathan, gets into the garden and tempts Eve. And as Eve is being tempted, Adam, if you read the text, is right there with her this whole time, saying nothing. I'm tempted to say, how many men do you know? But I'll just indict myself. And maybe if you're willing to come along with me, you can as well. How many times have you been Adam? How many times have I been Adam? Standing by as evil engages in conversations with my loved ones, as evil creeps in my world, as evil challenges those around me. And I stand back for the sake of comfort, my own comfort. I stand back for the sake of feeling ignorant or ill-prepared. I'm tempted to say, hey, you think of men like this, like Adam, but it's me. So Adam fails to protect the garden, and evil enters. Adam was called to cultivate and till the soil, but because of sin, God says the soil, the earth, is going to be hard. It's not going to yield its fruit as easily for you anymore. There's going to be a struggle. Adam was given the ability to create life. And again, we can gloss over this point. God creates. And we have been given the unique ability to create life that has an eternal soul. Sometimes I think about that. I look at my kids. My daughter turned 5 yesterday. And I look at her, and she is dragging me towards sanctity in so many ways. By her attitude, which makes me terrified for when she will be a teenager. I don't know how it gets worse than it is now. Hopefully it doesn't. We're getting it out of the way right now as a 5-year-old. But I'm like, she didn't exist once. She will exist forever. And I'm responsible for that. Partly. We have the ability to create. But this creative element isn't just relegated to creating new life. We can create in profound ways, but we can also destroy. That's the flip side. We can use our creative powers to be destructive. Now, Jesus exemplifies all of these things. Jesus is the perfect protector. He's the perfect protector of his own. At the end of the Gospel of John, people come to arrest Jesus. And Jesus looks at the guards and says, I am the one you're looking for. Leave these others alone. And then John notes that this was to fulfill what Jesus had said, I have not lost any of those which you've given to me. So guards come to arrest Jesus, and why wouldn't they arrest everybody with him? After all, if Jesus is accused of about to foment a revolution, why wouldn't you take the rest of his gang? But Jesus stands in front. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus is arrested, the imagery is so powerful. Because Jesus stands up, he says, I am he, and like the soldiers fall down. He's so confident. He's so powerful. And he stands in front of the disciples who are probably like, this is it. We're about to get arrested. And Jesus says, let them go. You want me. Jesus protected those who were in his garden, those he was given care of. But Jesus protected those outside too. At one point, Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, but I have some sheep who are not of this flock. At another point, there's this story of a Syro-Phoenician woman, which I think is one of the best narratives that happens with Jesus. Because Jesus employs a teaching style that a lot of us don't get. And some people have mistakenly interpreted this passage, I think, in a couple of different ways. The synopsis is this. Jesus is met by a Syro-Phoenician woman. She's a Gentile. But she's heard about Jesus and the fact that he's a healer. So this woman says, Jesus, my daughter is ill. Can you heal her? Now, this is not a child of the house of Israel. And so the crowd with Jesus, particularly his disciples, are thinking, why are you bothering with this woman? Like, she's outside. She's not in our group. She's not one of the children of the house of Israel. And the disciples they did this a couple times. People would come up to ask for healing for Jesus, and we get images in the Gospels of the disciples being like, hey, could you back up a little bit? Can you not bother the master anymore? Just keep moving, Jesus. Just, can you go away? Jesus always hears. But you get this image of the disciples perhaps being like, oh man, here's another non-Jewish person asking Jesus to heal them. Some people have looked at this story and said the woman changes Jesus' mind. Because then Jesus says, don't you know that I was sent for the children of the house of Israel? And then the woman says, but even the dogs eat the scraps from the table of the children. And Jesus says, you have great faith, your daughter's been healed. So some people have been like, see, the woman changes Jesus' mind. I don't think so. Jesus reads the minds of his disciples, and he's read minds before. He reads hearts. And he says what the disciples are thinking. So he looks at the woman, because he's going to teach the disciples. He says, well, don't you know that I was sent to the children of the house of Israel? I'm not sent for you. You're a Gentile. And the disciples in their mind are like, yeah, get her, Jesus. She's not one of us. She's on the outside group. That's not your mission. And now Jesus has him right where he wants him, because he sets her up to make a reply that teaches the disciples, and consequently us. Jesus protects those in and those out. Who is my neighbor? Jesus cultivated virtue in a life of prayer. He often went away to lonely places to pray. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke is 12 when he's at the temple engaging in rabbinic discourse. That's what he's doing as he's asking and answering questions of the scholars who are there. But he goes back and he's obedient to his parents for the next 18 years. Growing in virtue, cultivating the relationship with the Father through prayer. Because Jesus knew our spiritual life takes intentionality. And then he creates. Jesus is present in the Trinity at the creation of the world. Remember, how does God create the world? He speaks. And in the beginning of the Gospel of John, who is Jesus? The divine Word, through which all things were created. But Jesus on the cross creates. On the resurrection, the 8th day, new life begins through that resurrection. Jesus is creator. But here's the rub with creation. Creation requires vulnerability because creation requires a death. Again, I think about my kids, and if you have children, you can identify. If you're married, you can identify. Hey, if you love somebody, you can identify. There is risk in creation. Because when you create, what you've created can hurt you. Sometimes intentionally, but sometimes unintentionally. You see, my kids, they're young, they're 7, almost 7, 5. But when they hurt, I hurt. When my son comes home from school, and some of you have had this experience, and says, I don't understand why that kid was mean to me, Dad, that'll break my heart. See, as love expands in the creative element, whether it's through kids or whether it's getting married. When you got married, if you have a spouse, the moment you got married, to love a person is to take on the hurts of that other person, to engage in their life and to open yourself up to the risk of love. And Jesus displays this vulnerability to the risk on the cross as he hangs naked, exposed. The very people who he is saving are mocking him and have crucified him. And he says, Father, forgive them. He is creator. And in all of these things, there's humility. To protect another is to lay down our life in humility. To cultivate virtue in our life is to continually evaluate places we need to grow and to recognize that our journey has not stopped. And to be creative is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to be humble. Jesus exemplifies these things as authentic masculinity. And so we have an opportunity to follow his example. Authentic masculinity done in humility is being a protector, a cultivator, and a creator. So here's the first step. Where has God called you to protect? What is your garden? Sometimes we think we kind of have an implicit idea, but what does that look like? If you really sit down and pray with it, which I'd love for you to do, what is the garden in your life? Who are the in-group that God has called you to protect? The people God has intentionally put in your life to say, you, oh man, are going to stand in the gap between the world and these people. If you have a family, by default, it is your family. By default, it is your spouse vocationally. If you are if you're a priest, if you're a deacon, by default, then it comes to the spiritual family, the parish in which you serve, the diocese in which you serve, the people that you serve. Who is the in-group? To protect these people is to lay aside our concerns. And again, that takes humility. It's no longer about what's best for me. It's about what's best for you. It's no longer about my agenda and my determination, but our agenda. How do we move forward? How do I stand in the gap? And then, how do you protect the out-group? You see, as Christians, you have a call to love your neighbor, to love your enemy. That means the people we don't disagree with. We live in a politically charged climate. Have you prayed for those politicians who oppose what we hold dear? For their good, for their conversion. In your programs, the Gospel Antiphon comes from Ezekiel. It's God speaking through the prophet. I don't desire the death of the wicked man. I desire his conversion. Do we protect those outside of our groups? Do we pray? Do we fast? Those are critical elements of protection. Because here's the other choice. You can protect or you can be apathetic. And if there's one disease among men that is killing our world, it is apathy. Not active evil, but I just don't care. It's not my problem. It's not my people. It's over. It's too far gone. Protect or apathy. What about cultivation? My son, a couple of years ago, when we were grocery shopping, threw a packet of carrot seeds into our cart, and I had no idea that those carrot seeds would grow into something wild. Not super wild, but I started a garden. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. Gardening is a little bit different down there, but I was like, sure, we'll give this a shot. Here's what I learned about gardening. Not as simple as just putting seeds in dirt. Doesn't work that way. There's all kinds of things you need to know. pH balance of the soil, proper water ratio, sun to shade ratio. It's all kinds of crazy things. I didn't grow anything in our first year. None of those carrots sprouted up. For some reason, I got into it. Gardening taught me a lot. The garden was either growing or it was dying. It never was stagnant. The garden was either well kept or was growing with weeds. The garden was either protected or was being infested. I learned about squash bugs and how quickly they can destroy a squash plant. I learned that cats like to use a garden as a litter box. I also learned that when cats do that, the garden is unusable and you've got to start over. Frustrating, but it caused me to reflect a little bit. How well do I cultivate the soil of my own heart? And Jesus tells that parable. There are 4 kinds of soil, right? There's rocky soil, there's thorny soil, there's shallow soil, then there's good soil. Which one are you? Which one am I? And am I allowing God to cultivate that soil with my cooperation? I guess the other note here is that if you're not cultivating virtue, vice is creeping up in your life. There is no such thing as stagnation in the spiritual life. You are either growing or you're becoming worse. You are moving from better to better to better, or you are in decline. There's no pause. That was the case with my garden. And there were some points where I had to realize that I needed to start over. And I'll say this as a brief aside because maybe for some of you it's important. When the cats pooped in my garden, it was over. I wanted to eat the fruit of that garden. I really, really did. I was going to have a good harvest of habanero peppers. I've been growing this habanero plant for like 3 years. But after some Google searching and some convincing from my wife, I realized that none of that was safe to eat because there was something toxic in that soil. For some of us here, there's something toxic in our spiritual life that we need to identify and to get rid of through confession, and then potentially through additional means to work through that addiction, that hurt, that wound, because it's spoiling all the fruit your life is starting to bear. One of the most profound moments I ever had in reconciliation was as I confessed to sin as a young man. The priest looked at me and said, "If you persist in this sin, your life will be a failure." It's the most stark comment I've ever heard from a priest in the sacrament of reconciliation. Sometimes priests they're merciful, and I love that. Sometimes a little bit too merciful. But I needed to hear it. If you persist in this sin, your life will be a failure. And that was it. I did not persist in the sin. But I'm always mindful that it lurks at the door, like every sin, wanting to be my master. What do you cultivate? And how do you cultivate it? Practices of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and Lent, we have these opportunities. Those things cultivate a spiritual life in us that is rich. Engage them, and engage them outside of Lent. But it requires intentionality. What do you create? We're either creating in our world or we're destroying something. By our actions as men, we are powerful to destroy in our world. But we have a great power to create life in our world by our actions and ultimately through self-sacrifice. That's where creation happens, through self-sacrifice. And that's where humility comes in. Self-sacrifice requires vulnerability, a kind of vulnerability that we are not always used to. An emotional vulnerability with those around us, with our kids, with our spouse, with our God, with our friends. And we fear vulnerability a little bit, at least I do, because I know that if I open myself to be vulnerable to somebody else, I have a fear of being wronged. They can hurt me. They can reject me. They can use the things I tell them in vulnerability against me. To sacrifice my life for one another, for another, to lay it down, is to open myself up to that person being like, I don't care about your sacrifice. And I bet some of you have felt that sting. The sting of a child who looked at you and said, I don't want your faith anymore. You don't need to shove that down my throat anymore. I have a family friend whose son grew up and actually filed a lawsuit against his mother for emotional distress because she raised him as Catholic. That's it. That's the lawsuit. No abuse, no emotional abuse, no physical abuse. She stuck by him when he came out. She loved him through all of that. But he's hurt. Something in his life hurt him. And he turned around and he said, "You imposed this faith on me. And now I need reparation for that." Can you imagine the sting? And yet she loves him and would give her life for him. That's the vulnerability of the creative act. And when we can do that, when we can engage in that creative act through vulnerability, which requires humility, life springs forth in our world, because now we start to live that authentic view of a man. I want you to think about what masculinity looks in our world if men started to adapt this mentality. If I'm a protector, I'm a cultivator of virtue, you look at a man and you say, wow, that guy, there's something about him. He goes from better to better to better. And he's humble enough to look at his setbacks and to say, even though I've had a setback, even though I've sinned, I will still continue to grow in virtue because I'm aware that I'm never done growing. That's why humility is necessary in cultivating virtue. Humility prevents us from ever thinking we're done. And there's a man who gives his life for another. If we can align that vision of who God says we are as protector, cultivator, creator, suddenly our life can start to make a little bit more sense. We can start to be authentic, and authenticity is the key to living true humility, which is so necessary in the world in which we live today. Because at the heart of humility is a desire for holiness. The last petition in the Litany of Humility is that others may become holier than I, provided that I become as holy as I should. That others would surpass me in the ranks of sanctity and sainthood, provided, Lord, I become as holy as you deem necessary for me to be to achieve sanctification. Do you desire that? A couple of weeks ago, I ran across this quote from Venerable Fulton Sheen, Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And I've been wrestling with it. I'm going to give it to you so you can wrestle with it too. Sorry. He says this. This is in his book, Peace of Soul. We want to be saved, but not from our sins. The great fear that many souls have of our divine Lord is for fear he will do just what his name, Jesus, implies, to be he who saves us from our sins. We are willing to be saved from poverty, from war, from ignorance, from disease, from economic insecurity. Such types of salvation leave our individual whims and passions and concupiscence as untouched. And this is the part that has rocked me. The reason we are not as happy as saints is because we do not wish to be saints. Do you wish to be a saint? I'm a proponent of a philosophy called extreme ownership. Extreme ownership says that in a business, in a leadership role, anything that happens is your fault. It's a humbling philosophy. It's true. I propose an extreme ownership of masculinity on our world. A humble extreme ownership. That says you and I in this room are responsible for the world in which we live. The world as it is now. And we have agency to do something about that by living as God calls us to be and by becoming holy. And in doing that, if we can live for the Lord who sees our heart and be authentic, that holiness will transform the world in which we live, at least your individual garden. And if all of that can happen and we can replicate ourselves, I'm not going to say change is going to happen overnight. You and I will not live to see the promised land. We won't. Like Moses, we will stand on the hills and watch. But it will bear fruit in the generations to come. I said at the beginning that the Litany of Humility was written by a guy named Raphael Cardinal Merry Delval. That's who it's attributed to. He adapted it, but he didn't write it. I did a little bit of research. In 1867, a little book called Fervent Adoration, The Fervent Adorer, was written by A.R.C. Clergyman. It's a pen name. The man who first wrote the words, "From the fear of being forgotten," is forgotten. His work attributed to somebody else. His work given to somebody else. And yet for that man, whoever he was, A.R.C. Clergyman, His legacy lives on by impacting millions of people who are devoted to saying the prayer of the Litany of Humility and have grown from better to better and grown in virtue because of it. It was written years before Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val was ever born. May our lives be similar in growing in holiness, in living authentically, so that though generations from now they will not know who you and I are, the fruit of what we have done will bear fruit in their life as well. My prayer is that you become men that when somebody sees you, they know just by your presence, by your spirituality, by your authenticity, that you're a man after the Lord's heart, that you've been transformed, and that they desire to know more about the one who transformed you.